Hello, our dear viewers. Hello to everyone watching us online. Today we continue our series of discussions dedicated to the events surrounding the 50th anniversary of the Apollo-Soyuz Test project. In one of our previous broadcasts, specifically the one where we analyzed together with Alexander Nikitin the strange Saturn family of rockets, I drew attention right at the beginning to one of the informational slides containing the technical description and specifications of the Soviet launch vehicle. It stated, and I deliberately read this aloud, that the rocket's payload capacity was 17.5 tons. Of course, our attentive viewers noticed this. Some people wrote negative comments about it. No, this wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate provocation. Now it's necessary to explain why it was done. Let's take another look at this very slide, which you now see on your screen. There are two errors on this slide, and I deliberately read them out. The first is the designation of the launch vehicle, Soyuz U, with that index and the stated payload capacity of 17.5 tons. There was no mistake in what I said, but please note that usually, in the materials we discuss here, I always provide references to some primary sources. For this slide, there were none, and it was shown and described at the very beginning on purpose. Here's why. The point is, this is a very popular slide. One of the world's most widely used search engines, and we shouldn't be afraid of calling things by their names, returns this slide among the very first results for a simple search query, Soyuz Apollo, Soviet rocket description. Look at the screenshot, you can see it on your screen right now. And this is exactly how modern young people, and indeed, anyone using the internet, quickly find what they're looking for. Based on these results, including such graphics, school students, college students, and university students write their reports and conduct their research. And these are the first results they see. If you change the search to Soyuz Apollo, American rocket description, this same slide appears as the first result again. This is what happens with image search. In a general search, the same thing happens. And even in a leading American search engine, this same slide for this exact same query also comes up first. Isn't this a deliberate act to ensure that this slide is always returned at the top of the results? And for what purpose? So that we don't know the truth, and so that later people can mock the interpretation of the facts that specialists and enthusiasts of this subject discuss. But then we need to understand where it even came from. I can tell you the following. This slide is one of the very first images in a video sequence that has been circulating not only online for at least 7 years, but also among materials distributed by major news networks. Here's an example. The website of the Izvestia newspaper. It even shows the publication date, July 17, 2018, timed exactly to the anniversary of that very event. It says that the Apollo-Soyuz Test project, also known as the Handshake in Space, was the first joint flight of Soviet and U.S. spacecraft, Soyuz 19 and Apollo, which took place on July 15, 1975. And there is a video clip titled 3D Model of the Soyuz 19 and Apollo spacecraft. You can see a screenshot right now. If you play it, you'll see at the beginning the same footage that you now see on the slide to the right. You can view it as a 3D model, and it shows this exact payload capacity. Over 7 years, this material has gained 133,000 views. It has spread widely across the internet. There are other sources that use it too, including news agencies that people turn to for such materials, the business community, ordinary people, and other search engines. So, everything we discussed here was a deliberate information provocation, intended to help clean up these poor quality materials. With your help and your active participation, we can overcome this if you submit appropriate requests to search engines to get such unreliable materials removed.
So, to understand what was happening in the summer of 1975, in July, we need to take a step back and find out what was happening at the start of 1970. Today I'll mainly rely on the data from the publications Soyuz and Apollo, published shortly afterward in 1976. The authors of this publication were the management and participants of the project, Bushuev, Seremyatnikov, Leonov, and others. That's why I'm focusing primarily on these official materials. So, they tell us that the very idea of some kind of joint project, I'm not talking specifically about docking yet, but generally a joint project between the USSR and the USA, emerged in the early 1970s, through an exchange of letters between the president of the USSR Academy of Sciences, Mstislav Keldysh, and the then NASA administrator, Thomas Paine. In my opinion, the timeline here is very interesting. Different sources say early 1970, spring 1970, or, at the latest, April 1970. But as we know, both the month of April and the spring of 1970 are clearly marked by the incident with Apollo 13. If this project was conceived after the Apollo 13 accident, that's one thing, and in that case, one could directly link it to that event. That is, the Apollo 13 accident happened, and then the idea emerged that another spacecraft could dock with a damaged spacecraft in orbit and thus rescue it. But nowhere is there any reference to Apollo 13. Everywhere it says early 1970, spring, April, and so on. In my opinion, this is very important, so let me offer a second version, perhaps not as obvious, but, in my view, quite interesting. What was the situation at the beginning of 1970? The United States was at the peak of its glory, at the height of triumph. They accomplished two successful moon landings, Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 in 1969. But suddenly, for some reason, despite these successful landings, in America, public interest in the moon missions began to decline. And it's not even about science. Let's be honest, the average person in any country isn't very interested in science. But this wasn't just some humans landing on another celestial body. No, it was your brave boys landing there and planting your very own stars and stripes. And yet, patriotic Americans didn't seem to care. Even with the help of the media, this patriotic narrative didn't gain much traction. A second point, also very interesting. According to the memoirs of Boris Chertok, Apollo 12 was the last Apollo mission that we officially tracked. Meaning, the Soviet Union only paid attention to the first four moon Apollos, Apollo 8, 10, 11, and 12. After that, for some reason, interest vanished. Here's Boris Chertok and his book as the source. And finally, an even more interesting point. In January 1970, Wernher von Braun, the creator of the Saturn rockets, was, as we would say, kicked upstairs. That is, he was transferred to NASA headquarters in Washington and promoted to a leadership role. Formally, that's a promotion, but in reality, it meant he was removed from actual design and engineering work. It would be like, say, if after Leonov's spacewalk, Sergei Korolyov were appointed Deputy Minister of General Machine Building. Formally a step up, but practically it would have removed him from hands-on work. And it was against this background that the idea of some kind of joint flight suddenly emerged, on the American side. Why do I say it was the Americans? Because, of course, Mstislav Keldysh, as we all understand, couldn't have proposed anything in a letter to the NASA administrator. Let alone proposing anything himself, Keldysh couldn't even agree to any initiative without a directive from the top leadership of the country, the General Secretary, the Chairman of the Supreme Soviet, and so on. So, it's openly stated that the initiative came from the United States. Moreover, I believe everything said applies to Thomas Paine as well. At best, he might have been the author of the idea, but in any case, the first person he had to discuss and coordinate it with was certainly not Keldysh, but the top leadership of the United States. At minimum the Vice President, and more likely the President himself. In other words, we inevitably arrive at the conclusion that the idea of a joint project had been agreed upon at the very highest level between the leaders of our two countries. And this agreement must have taken place no later than the spring of 1970. Why am I speaking in such general terms? Some kind of joint project? Because we should immediately ask, why would the Americans, basking in the glory of their moon triumph, want a joint project with the Soviet Union? Was it some goodwill gesture from the victors of the moon race? That's possible, but quite rare. Both the Americans and we had our hands full. The Americans still had several more moon landings ahead, the launch of the Skylab station, and the space shuttle program on the horizon. And all this was happening against a backdrop of shrinking budgets. Funding was decreasing, and yet suddenly this idea of a politically dead-end project emerges. Why it was a dead end, I'll explain in more detail later. Things weren't much better on the Soviet side, arguably worse. We were struggling with the Salyut space station program. As of 1970, our moon program hadn't yet been officially shut down. We were still sending lunohods to the moon and launching interplanetary probes. So, we had plenty on our plate too, and yet we also agreed to this project. Here's my version. The Americans needed this joint project to use the Soviet Union's participation as confirmation of their moon landings. After all, it's one thing to get a congratulatory telegram from Podgorny or Kosygin. By the way, I don't think Brezhnev personally congratulated the Americans, but even if he did, today it's Brezhnev, tomorrow someone else. He could be overthrown, just like Khrushchev was recently, and blamed for everything, accused of being a CIA asset, etc. In short, political leadership can change, and with it, policy. But a joint project is something tangible. You can't walk that back or brush it off. And we still see the effects today. 50 years later, NASA supporters still cite Apollo-Soyuz as proof. What about that mission? Was that a hoax too? So, in that sense, the Americans' plan worked perfectly. But then a second question arises. What would be the simplest and cheapest way to prove not the moon landing itself, but the existence of hardware capable of taking men to the moon? The cheapest, most reliable, and most straightforward method would be to take a Soviet cosmonaut to the Skylab station, which was to be launched shortly afterward. Secrecy isn't really an issue here, since the Americans had already shown the Soviets the Apollo spacecraft, and later they would display the Saturn IB rocket in museums. So, secrecy is not the point. A visit by a Soviet cosmonaut to Skylab would kill two birds with one stone. First, it would prove the existence of the Apollo spacecraft. And second, if there is a massive station in orbit, 77 tons according to official data, that means it must have been launched there by a Saturn V rocket. That would also confirm the existence of the Saturn V. Cheap, clear, practical. Everything proven. But for some reason, the Americans opted for a more complicated, dead-end project involving docking with the Soyuz. Why? Because in that case, a second spacecraft would be introduced into the project, one that would actually fly into space, and the entire real flight aspect of the mission could be delegated to it. Look, here's the scorched capsule that landed with Leonov and Kabasov. Here's some footage in zero gravity. Look at the Russians' meticulous preparation. This is something I'll cover in detail as well. And so on. That's why a joint project was needed. It seemed to prove everything. Now, moving from the informational and ideological side to the rationale. Aside from the ideological narrative, space friendship, détente, and all that, the official justification for this docking project was the ability to rescue one spacecraft in orbit using another. But this phrase should be taken literally. It refers specifically to rescuing the Soyuz spacecraft using the last remaining Apollo. Because, somehow, quite conveniently, the Americans had calculated things so precisely that they were left with only one final Apollo spacecraft. Starting in 1971, the last 3 moon landings, Apollos 18, 19, and 20, would be cancelled. According to the official version, the 3 saved Apollos would be used to visit the Skylab station, leaving one final Apollo spacecraft. What's interesting again is that, by various estimates, Skylab cost the Americans between $2 and $7 billion. So, they had a real, expensive station and a functioning program. It wasn't damaged, it was in a high orbit, stocked with food, water, and oxygen. They could fly to it at least one more time, probably more. They could have squeezed more out of that station, for scientific work, for gaining experience. But instead of continuing to produce Apollo spacecraft and flying to their own station, the Americans abandoned it, a working, real project, and shifted focus to the Apollo-Soyuz Test project. Again, I'll repeat, a purely ideological, dead-end project. For some reason, they desperately needed it. For its sake, they were willing to forget about their own station. So, we're talking about a single Apollo spacecraft. By the way, this automatically answers another question. NASA supporters constantly argue. NASA employed a lot of people, 400,000. If the moon landings had been fake, someone would have spilled the beans long ago. Well, here you have a completely non-secret project. Nothing is hidden. All participants knew from the beginning that it was a dead-end project, in the sense that this was the last Apollo spacecraft. No more would be produced. No similar spacecraft were planned. The focus was shifting to the space shuttle. But no one, neither in 1976, nor 50 years later, writes about this. Even though it's not classified, not forbidden, and perfectly obvious.
In 1975,
I mean the date of the publication. And even now, although the country has changed, the ideology has supposedly changed too. Everyone keeps writing that this was a project that opened the path to space cooperation, to future dockings, and so on. Yet those future dockings were with the shuttle. First with the Mir station in the mid-90s, and later with the ISS. But those projects were completely different. There was nothing similar to the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz project. So, to claim that this project paved the way for cooperation, which in reality resumed only 20 years later, is, to put it mildly, a stretch. Now, moving from rationale to ideological points. As I mentioned, the project was initiated in 1970. By October of that year, engineers and designers from both countries were already visiting each other and discussing specific technical details. But the official start was in 1972, when the agreements were signed. The strangest agreement that was signed was the one concerning information for the public. It was called, on information policy, oddly enough, not on informing. What sort of strange thing is this? Since when does one sovereign state make an agreement with another about its own information policy? And especially which states? Two ideologically opposed countries with completely different principles governing media operations. Why on earth would we and the Americans agree with each other on how to cover the mission? After all, we are the direct participants. We'll present it to Soviet viewers however we see fit. You do the same for your own public. What's the point? Usually it's criminals, or if you prefer, suspects in court, who coordinate their stories so the versions match. So why this kind of coordination here? The official explanation for why this agreement was made is the following. The first, we are told that under this information agreement, the mission insignias for the flight were designed. Which sounds utterly ridiculous. Thousands of international treaties are signed every day, each with its own official symbols. A couple of artists, or even a few dozen, get together, sketch some ideas, the leadership approves them, and that's it. The amusing part is this. NASA has long had a tradition that astronauts design their own mission insignias. And Leonov, who took part in the Apollo-Soyuz flight, was an artist himself. For him, drawing a mission insignia would have been a piece of cake. He didn't have to paint the Mona Lisa, just a simple insignia. So why did this require an international agreement? The second justification for this flight was mentioned by Cernan in his book. Within the framework of this agreement, a television group was supposedly created at NASA specifically to handle TV broadcasts of this flight. In my opinion, that's nonsense. Television broadcasts from Apollo missions had been going on since the very first crewed mission, Apollo-7. So, some kind of television group at NASA had already long existed and was fully functional. They had extensive experience with such broadcasts. In 1972 or even 74, this group had not yet been dissolved because the moon landings were still ongoing. Those also included live broadcasts. There were even broadcasts from the Skylab station. So, in 1972, when this agreement was signed, this group physically existed. There was no need to create anything new. Yet someone invented this ridiculous justification. Now, from ideological justification, we move on to technical evaluation and oddities of this flight. So, the project consisted of docking two spacecraft. The engineers and the authors of the publication, Soyuz and Apollo, openly stated, to dock two spacecraft, they must of course be compatible. But the Soyuz and Apollo spacecraft were absolutely incompatible in every way. And this complex problem had to be solved. Let's start with the most critical, most obvious, and largest incompatibility: the docking mechanism. The basic principles of the docking systems were similar, both used the probe and drogue system. But their sizes and mechanisms differed significantly. It was necessary to create a universal docking system. The official justification for the flight, as I mentioned, was the ability to have any spacecraft rescued by any other. So, the docking mechanism had to be universal. That's why it was later called IPAS-75, the androgynous peripheral attach system. Androgynous means, it combined elements of both passive and active docking mechanisms. There was no probe in this case, only spade-shaped guides. Now let's ask the obvious question: who should be assigned to develop the docking mechanism? Let's look into it. As of 1972 or 74, doesn't really matter. America was officially the absolute world leader in the number of dockings. These dockings, or more precisely, what they called dockings, began during the Gemini program as rendezvous with the Agena target vehicle. Then came numerous dockings and redockings in Earth and lunar orbit during the Apollo program, followed by landings on the Moon. In 1973, there were also dockings with the Skylab station. So, we're talking about dozens of successful dockings in various scenarios. They had long ago developed docking mechanisms with transfer tunnels allowing crew to move from one spacecraft to another, and so on. And what about us? Here's a list of all our dockings from 1968 to 1974. The first docking attempt on Soyuz 3 was unsuccessful. Beregovoy couldn't dock with the unmanned Soyuz 2. He simply confused up and down, and the docking failed. Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5. The docking was successful, but the docking system was rather basic and not pressurized. The spacecraft docked in space, and cosmonauts Yeliseyev and Krenov moved from one craft to the other through outer space. This was done as part of the preparations for our moon program. The next docking was between Soyuz 7 and Soyuz 8, with Soyuz 6 flying around them to photograph the process. This proves that equipment capable of filming from the outside in space already existed. This was in 1969. That docking also failed. In his book, Feoktistov called this mission a threesome in orbit. So, it ended up being 3 solo Soyuz missions. The docking didn't take place. Soyuz 10 attempted docking with the Salyut 1 station in May 1970, a failure. Soyuz 11 docked successfully with the same station Salyut 1, but the crew, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev, died during re-entry. Then came Soyuz 14 with cosmonauts Popovich and Artukin. This was already in 1974. It docked successfully with Salyut 3. Soyuz 15 with cosmonauts Demin and Safronov also tried to dock with Salyut 3, but failed. So overall, we had 3 successful dockings out of 7, about 43%. And the last of these were in 1974. If we removed those, then the 5 earlier dockings between 1968 and 71 resulted in only 2 successes, 40%, even lower. In short, our track record with dockings was, to put it mildly, not great. So, what is the obvious answer to the question? Who should be tasked with developing the docking mechanism? Of course, the job went to the Soviet engineer Vladimir Seremyatnikov. To jump ahead a bit, it's worth noting that in addition to the IPAS-75 docking system, Seremyatnikov later developed the docking mechanism for the Mir station. He also created the docking system for the Buran shuttle to dock with Mir. But since Buran was never used for that, the module was sold to the Americans for $18 million, so that their shuttles could dock with Mir. Later, he also developed the docking systems for the ISS, allowing the US shuttles to dock there as well. So, it was our very own Vladimir Seremyatnikov who built the modules that enabled US shuttles to dock with the International Space Station.
To be fair, what he developed later for Mir and the ISS involved somewhat different technical solutions based on accumulated experience. But at the core were the developments of 1974-75.
I should clarify that in the later systems, the androgynous design was completely abandoned, meaning, the concept of universal compatibility was dropped. And they returned to the probe and drogue type systems, both on our side and theirs. So again, this project turned out to be a technical dead end. Let me briefly mention the IPAS-75 mechanism. According to the Americans themselves, it turned out to be more elegant and half the weight of the American-built half of the docking unit. In other words, while the mechanism was compatible, each country made their half in its own way. Ours was lighter and featured an electromechanical capture system with latches, while the Americans used hydraulics. And that ended up backfiring on them. I'll return to that point when I talk about the mission itself. So, we've dealt with the docking system. Next, the communication systems of the 2 spacecraft were incompatible. I'm not a radio specialist, feel free to correct me. But I always thought that any radio transmitter has a dial you can use to tune into a specific frequency. Yet, for some reason, that wasn't done in this project. Instead, the 2 countries simply exchanged transmitters that operated on the other side's frequency. In other words, the Americans gave us their transmitter so we could communicate with Houston on their frequency, and we gave them ours. There are 2 interesting points here. We installed the American transmitter in the orbital module of Soyuz, but it produced so much heat that a separate cooling system had to be installed. This is mentioned in the publication Soyuz and Apollo, but the quote ends there. It doesn't say whether additional radiators were needed or how exactly the cooling system was built. But here's the more curious part. Why did the crew of Apollo 13 freeze if the American transmitters generated so much heat and their equipment in general was so heat-producing? The story with our transmitter is even more interesting. First, we built it with extra care, insulating all the contacts as much as possible to prevent any sparks, so that it could safely operate in Apollo's pure oxygen atmosphere. But here's the question. Where did the Americans install our transmitter? Seems like a strange thing to ask. Where else would it go but in the command module, right? But no, they put it in the docking module. So, if for any reason the crew couldn't access the docking module, which apparently did happen during the flight, then Apollo would have no way to communicate either with Moscow or with the Soyuz during flight. It's as if they said, guys, things didn't work out, so there's nothing to talk about. We'll call Houston, and they'll let you know that the docking is cancelled. That's how that curious transmitter placement decision went. And this is one of the most crucial elements of docking, communications between the two spacecraft. And yet, there you have it. Interestingly, even our timekeeping didn't match. We used Moscow time. The Americans used mission time. And our side was fine with anything, Moscow time, Houston time, Greenwich time, whatever. But no, the Americans insisted, only mission time. So again, we had to agree, and additional mission time clocks were installed in the Soyuz's orbital module to count from the moment of the Soyuz's launch, since Soyuz launched first.
Probably, we should explain to our viewers what mission time actually means.
I'll explain it now. Mission time is counted from the moment of launch. For the Americans, it's typically from the launch of their spacecraft. But since Soyuz launched first, I'll explain why later. In this case, the mission time started from the Soyuz launch. Here's an interesting point. I've known about it for a long time, but I used to think it was just my subjective impression. After all, using mission elapsed time is inconvenient. You read the reports, and it says something like, the 105th hour of the mission, the 200th hour, and so on. But it turns out it's not just my personal impression, it really is inconvenient. The thing is, all people, Americans, Russians, it doesn't matter, live according to what's known as circadian or daily rhythms. We need the alternation of day and night. If a person is thrown off this rhythm, their sleep is disturbed, their performance drops, they become irritable, and so on. That's why nowadays, the ISS observes Greenwich Mean Time. Because even though the concept of sunrise and sunset is blurred in orbit, with 16 sunrises and sunsets in a day, astronauts are still scheduled for sleep, rest, day, night, work, meals, and so on. If it's, say, the 105th hour of the mission, what does that mean? Is it night, day, time to sleep, eat, work? It's unclear. The body's rhythm gets disrupted. This issue continued during the shuttle era as well. But once the shuttle flights ended, the Americans also switched to Earth-based timekeeping. I started thinking about it. Why were they so insistent on keeping it that way for so long? Who is it actually convenient for? Who benefits from it? And I came to the conclusion that only two small groups of people find it useful. The first group, all loosely called telemetry engineers, who monitor the spacecraft's telemetry data. They look at things like what happened at the 50th second, stage separation, and so on. Now, first of all, such telemetry teams exist both in America and here. But for some reason, we didn't cater to the telemetry teams. From Gagarin's very first flight, everything was timed according to Moscow time. Secondly, telemetry specialists receive data in the format in which it was recorded. If it's recorded in mission elapsed time, that's how they get it. I think if you reprogrammed the system to use Earth-based time, they'd receive it that way instead. So, it seems like a weak argument. Then I thought of another group for whom this timekeeping format would be very convenient. Let's call them the scriptwriters of the mission. If the flight plan is written a year or two before the mission itself, of course the exact dates and crew names aren't known yet. So, it's hard to write that into a scenario. But if you write a placeholder scenario that says, at the 105th hour we reach the moon, land on it, and at the 260th hour we return to Earth, and so on, that's very convenient. It fits any season, any time of day, any crew. Then this script is simply read out by the actual participants, either live or as a recording presented as live. It's very convenient and allows you to prepare everything in advance.
A soap opera?
Yeah, something like that. And with the shuttles, I think they kept using this system mostly out of tradition. It had been done that way before, so they kept doing it on the shuttles too. But modern astronauts who flew on the shuttles said it was inconvenient. When the shuttle era ended and they started flying to the ISS, they were happy to switch to normal Earth-based time. But of course, the oddities and incompatibilities didn't end there. As is well known, the internal atmospheres of the spacecraft were incompatible. We had air at a pressure of 1 atmosphere. The Americans had pure oxygen at 1/3 atmosphere. The Americans flat out refused to modify their Apollo. This is our last spacecraft, we're not changing anything at all. So, the burden fell on us to modify the Soyuz. Switching entirely to a pure oxygen atmosphere wasn't possible. It would have required a complete redesign of the spacecraft. So, a compromise was reached. If Soyuz had kept its regular air pressure of 1 atmosphere, the cosmonauts would have had to spend 5 to 6 hours in the docking module to adjust before entering Apollo. Instead, they lowered the pressure in Soyuz to 543 mm of mercury and increased the oxygen concentration to 40%. With such conditions over a 2-day flight, the nitrogen in the cosmonauts' blood would partly dissipate, and the time spent in the docking module could be reduced to just 1 or 2 hours. These modifications led to the creation of a new version of Soyuz, called the 7KTM, TM meaning modified. Only 6 of these spacecraft were built, or maybe as many as 6, depending on how you look at it. I'll say right away, we never needed that spacecraft again, and it was never used after that. The first 2, designated Cosmos 638 and Cosmos 672, made unmanned test flights in April and August of 1974. The third spacecraft, Soyuz 16, flew in December 1974 with cosmonauts Filipchenko and Rukavishnikov. That was a full dress rehearsal for the ASTP. Their Soyuz had the docking mechanism attached. They simulated approach and docking. They also used a transmitter that operated on the Houston frequency to communicate with Houston. So, it was essentially a dress rehearsal of the joint flight. The fourth craft, Soyuz 19, flew the actual mission in July 1975 with Leonov and Kabasov on board. How thoroughly did we prepare for the mission? If something had gone wrong with Soyuz 19, or if something had gone wrong with Apollo and it had launched, say, a day later, then a fully fueled backup Soyuz 20 was standing by on the launch pad. It was ready to go, with Filipchenko and Rukavishnikov scheduled to launch aboard it for a second attempt to dock with Apollo. That spacecraft was later simply dismantled for parts, because at the time, the autonomy of a fueled Soyuz loaded with toxic hydrazine was just 75 days. Since it wasn't needed, whatever hadn't corroded was just taken apart for spares. The last spacecraft of this series, Soyuz M under the index Soyuz 22, flew in 1976 with Bykovsky and Artukin. That was also a fully autonomous mission, since Soyuz 22 couldn't dock with a station, so some kind of laboratory module was attached to it. And that marked the end of our use of the so-called Soyuz M spacecraft. So, we had invested in building 6 spacecraft and 6 launch vehicles that ultimately weren't needed at all. By the way, about the cost. The ASTP project cost the Americans only $245 million, but that's not pure spending. Most of that amount was the cost of the Saturn 1B rocket and the Apollo spacecraft, which they already had at the time. The actual spending was around $2 to $3 million, which they used to build the docking module, since Apollo had to deliver it. Incidentally, since there were no other Apollo spacecraft available, they never tested this docking module in space. Our cosmonaut Vladimir Shah-Talov shared his thoughts in the publication, Soyuz and Apollo. We tested everything we could in real flights. If we had been tasked with manufacturing a docking module, we would have also tested it in at least one real flight. But the Americans didn't think it was necessary. Come on, just a 2 or 3 ton piece of hardware. We'll dock, redock, no problem. What's the big deal? Of course, the incompatibility between the 2 spacecraft didn't end there. As I mentioned, they had different internal atmospheres and pressures. And our engineers even thought of this. Back then, as now, Russian space food is packaged at normal atmospheric pressure. But someone realized that if our cosmonauts were flying at reduced pressure, or wanted to share food with the Americans by going into Apollo, then when the packaging was opened, the contents would just explode and scatter all over the cabin. So, they figured out how to package the food under reduced pressure. End of quote. And what does that mean? It means they put the food into a pressure chamber, various types of food, and placed 2 or more packaging machines inside. There had to be multiple machines because there were tubes, cans, and vacuum-sealed packets, all different types of containers for different foods. They also had to place a cook or, more accurately, a food technologist inside the chamber. And under reduced pressure, they packaged dozens of meals, because they had to last several days for 2 crews. That's how meticulously we prepared. They even thought of things like that. Returning to the oxygen atmosphere inside the Apollo spacecraft. Because of the oxygen atmosphere, the Americans made the following demand. Our cosmonauts had to wear fireproof suits. According to the cited publication, the Americans supposedly sent us samples of their fireproof fabrics and threads, from which we were to sew suits for our cosmonauts. But this information somehow reached a British journalist, who then trumpeted it to the whole world, claiming that the Soviet Union was such a poor country that it couldn't even make its own fireproof fabric. That hit Soviet pride hard. As a result, in just a year and a half, several fireproof fabric samples were developed. The chosen sample was called Lola. Its oxygen index was 79, compared to 41 for the American fabric. In other words, the Americans themselves acknowledged that our fabric was twice as good as theirs. Then comes a very funny phrase. Therefore, the need to transfer fabric samples was no longer relevant. This reminds me of an old Jewish joke. A man sends his relative a cable. I had money. Wanted to send you some. I will have money, I'll send more. Let's take a closer look at this fabric situation. First of all, were the samples transferred or not? Because I'm absolutely convinced that our intelligence and technical specialists in any field were always interested in acquiring samples of anything, to understand the secrets of production, dyes, fabrics, etc. So, I highly doubt we would have declined those samples out of pride alone. Second, what does that even mean? We sent the samples. Today we fly Americans and other foreign astronauts to the ISS aboard Soyuz spacecraft. Not only do we provide suits, we sew them custom Sokol spacesuits, which cost much more. If you want our cosmonauts to wear fireproof suits, and they visited America, then just take their measurements and sew the same suits as for your astronauts. What's the problem? Why this strange song and dance about handing over fabric samples? Here's the fabric, sew it yourselves. I'd say that feels a bit petty, even inappropriate. Nevertheless, we handled it ourselves and sewed fireproof suits for our cosmonauts. Next point. It was extremely difficult to coordinate the launch time. Both sides had strict conditions. Our ballistics experts said, the launch time had to be such that the Soyuz returned and landed at least 1 hour before sunset. Also, the deorbit burn had to occur on the sunlit side of the Earth so that if anything went wrong, the cosmonauts would have time to get their bearings. So, the earliest acceptable launch time for Soyuz was 16:30 Moscow time. Let's remember that time. The Americans had their own conditions. Let me remind you that Apollo was to launch 7.5 hours after Soyuz. Well, Apollo had to launch at least 3 hours before sunset so that if there was a launch failure, they would have 3 hours of daylight to fish the capsule out of the ocean and rescue the crew. So, counting backward from the Apollo launch, the Soyuz would have to lift off no later than 1500 Moscow time. That's why our ballistic experts joked that the only suitable launch date was February 30th. It would seem that the requirements were quite reasonable, but let's compare them. So, our ballistics experts were planning around the landing of the Soyuz spacecraft. Because both Soyuz tragedies, Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 11, happened precisely during re-entry. Naturally, it's best to find the landed capsule as long as there is daylight, before darkness falls. Also, the cosmonauts might be weakened or injured. So, everything is quite clear here. What were the Americans planning around? They were basing their requirements on a scenario that had never actually happened to them, an Apollo launch failure. They had never experienced this. But the most interesting thing is this. They launched Apollo-17 at night, and it didn't bother them at all that they might have to search for the capsule in the dark. Here's another curious point. The Americans didn't care at all about the Apollo landing time, absolutely. And yet, the launch time is well known. The trajectory after launch is also known. So, if something goes wrong, the search area in the ocean is more or less predictable. But the landing zone for the Apollo capsule is always wider, because if you fire the deorbit engine a few seconds too early or too late, you can end up several hundred or even 1,000 kilometers off. But again, the Americans weren't concerned at all about the Apollo landing time. Once again, we made concessions to the Americans. We gave up 1 hour and 10 minutes of our preferred launch window, and they gave us back 20 minutes from theirs. As a result, Soyuz 19 launched at 15:20 Moscow time. And of course, the oddness didn't end there. Now, a few words about the astronaut and cosmonaut training. First, the American astronauts were very impressed with Soviet equipment. Tom Stafford said quite openly that Soviet simulators were very comfortable, simple, reliable, and enjoyable to work with. And then he said something else. We all dreamed of flying on the Soyuz spacecraft. Well, how about that? You flew on Apollo. Some NASA enthusiasts claim it was a spacecraft ahead of its time. You orbited the moon on Apollo. Why would you dream of flying on Soyuz? That's like a Mercedes owner dreaming of driving a Volga car. Maybe just for the experience or the thrill? It's not entirely clear. Another interesting point. The measurement systems didn't match. As we know, we use meters and kilograms, while the Americans use feet and pounds. And again, what's curious is that the Americans agreed to use the metric system, but only in flight. They kept training with feet and pounds. Our ballistics and engineers were literally tearing their hair out when the Americans sent training reports with data off by a factor of 3. All because of the feet to meters confusion. But any sensible person understands that the value of such training is exactly 0. If you're going to use meters in the mission, you should be training with meters too. You're not going to rewire your brain in a few minutes or hours during flight if your whole life, 40 or 50 years, you've only ever used feet. So, such training is only useful for those who never actually plan to fly. If we're not going, why bother with all this meter and kilogram stuff? Otherwise, the training is just meaningless. Next point. The Americans were thrilled to be invited to test the Soyuz life support systems. Every imaginable situation was simulated during these tests. Depressurization, failed docking, and so on. As a result, our cosmonauts spent 2 days in spacesuits inside the Soyuz descent module simulator. The spacecraft's life support system handled everything perfectly. The Americans were simply amazed. Here's a quote taken from the publication, Soyuz and Apollo, very much in the sharp satirical style of the famous Russian stand-up comedian Javanetsky. Our engineers wrote, "Unfortunately, we weren't able to attend the tests of the American life support system, because the Americans openly stated that everything had already been tested long ago, and there was simply nothing left to test." End of quote. Our engineers even anticipated a scenario that might occur during docking. The spacecraft irradiate each other with radio signals. Our side thought that the radio signals from the Apollo spacecraft could potentially initiate pyros that separate the modules of our spacecraft. The Americans limited themselves to irradiating a full-scale mock-up. Our team, as always, took a more serious approach. They took each individual pyro fastener and irradiated it until it actually triggered. In other words, they obtained quantitative characteristics of the potentially dangerous radio signal. Next, we ran tests based on the American methodology too. We irradiated full-scale mock-ups of the Soyuz spacecraft. Then we asked the Americans to carry out tests using our methodology. And what did the Americans do? Take note. They promised to send a report stating that they had conducted such tests. No further comment needed. Here's another interesting detail. On this slide you see the docking target that was installed on the Soyuz spacecraft. It was needed for Apollo attitude control. We docked using radio beacons, but the Americans used optical visual systems, in simpler terms, as one thinks fit. There weren't many suitable places to install the target, because it had to be visible from a specific window on the Apollo spacecraft. It would seem like a small piece of metal, maybe a couple of kilograms at most. So, what's the problem? The first time it was installed on an uncrewed Soyuz M spacecraft, known as Cosmos 638. It turned out that during module separation on re-entry, the target was hit by a jet, either from a pyro device or a braking engine. As a result, the descent module began to spin unexpectedly, and the descent followed a more ballistic trajectory. If there had been cosmonauts aboard, they would have experienced forces up to 8 g. This issue was corrected during the next uncrewed mission, Cosmos 672. Again, we're talking about testing even small bits of metal weighing just a few kilograms under real flight conditions. I'm not even mentioning the airlock chamber, which weighed 2 to 3 tons. In my opinion, the most vivid illustration of the Americans' attitude towards Soviet technology comes from footage in the film Soyuz Apollo, Handshake in Orbit. Kabasov is explaining the design of the Soyuz spacecraft to the Americans. Just look at their eyes glowing, and, quite literally, their jaws dropping. And these are professionals. They're supposed to at least have a general understanding of how things work. A simple, this does that, and this is done like that, should have been enough. But look at the way they ask questions, how curious they are. They're staring at the equipment with their mouths open. They're amazed by it, they admire it. And those aren't my words. That's what you see in the actual footage from the Soyuz and Apollo publication. And now, let's take a look at the footage of our cosmonauts, Leonov and Kabasov, inside the Apollo spacecraft simulator in the US. There's really nothing to comment on, completely blank expressions. It honestly looks like they're telling each other jokes rather than discussing the design of the Apollo spacecraft.
What is there even to see?
There's just nothing to look at. They had a look, sure, it's the Apollo spacecraft. By the way, speaking of our evaluation of Apollo, Vladimir Shah-Talin, an experienced cosmonaut who visited the US, was shown the Apollo spacecraft. And all he had to say about it was this: the seat arrangement is a bit different, and it's designed more like an airplane. That's it. That's all a decorated cosmonaut noticed about a spacecraft that supposedly took people to the moon. Honestly, it feels like the authors of this publication treat the Apollo spacecraft the way you'd treat a dead man. You know the saying, speak no ill of the dead. And so, when it comes to Apollo, they don't say anything at all. In fact, there's even a line in the book saying that Soyuz and Apollo can't really be compared, because they were created for entirely different purposes. Apollo was designed to go to the moon, while Soyuz was intended for low Earth orbit. That's just the standard lie of the mid-70s. Back then, you still couldn't talk about our own moon program. But now we know full well that Soyuz was developed for the same purpose as Apollo moon missions. At the end of the day, who cares what these spacecraft were originally intended for? Right now, they're both performing the same task, docking in low Earth orbit. So, compare them on that. In the mid-70s, if you couldn't praise American engineering, then at least praise your own. Say something like, here was the challenge. The Americans solved it this way, but we solved it better. But no, our engineers and designers go out of their way to avoid any comparisons with Apollo. And with that, I'll wrap up the story of preparations for the joint flight. Next, I'll talk about the mission itself, who took part, what happened, and so on.